Hey, everybody, welcome back to The Negotiation. My name is Todd Embley, and I am your host as usual. And I am pleased to be joined by Morgan Keldsen. He is an international business development, omni-channel retail, merchandising, product creation expert. Morgan has worked with a variety of iconic brands, including Nike, Converse, Stussy, Vans, names that everybody who's cool should know and recognize immediately. He is the principal behind Keldsen Consulting, where he advises organizations in the athletic and fashion lifestyle space, all around business development in the Asia Pacific region. Morgan, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Todd. Great to be here with you.
Okay, cool. First, let's set the stage. Where are you in the world today where you're recording from?
So I'm calling in from Melbourne, Australia, where it's summertime.
Yes, I know. I'm so jealous. Obviously, I'm in Canada, where it is very much not summertime. I gave the preliminary introduction into some of your background and the brands you've worked with, but can you do me about 10 times better and maybe give a little bit more of a background and introduction into yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, I've spent almost 30 years working for the sportswear and fashion brands you mentioned in Asia Pacific, really helping focus on the brands and the business and growing them across the region. And as you mentioned, right now, I'm currently doing some downtime working with some smaller brands, helping them explore the opportunities in the region, but basically a lifelong Asia guy. So really happy to be on the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm curious to know how you ended up in China. I think everybody who does end up in Asia has a pretty cool story. It's one of those tripped, fell, landed in China, and then stayed for like 30 years. And it's always cool how that happened. So, tell us a little bit about that. And then tell us about how you started with Nike in Guangzhou in 1993.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I love telling the story, and it's always props to my mom, who was the one that set the vision very early on. She's actually from the Philippines and born and raised there. My dad met her there, got married, but then I was born in the States. But going into junior high and high school, I studied French. I either could do French or Spanish at my school. And as I was getting ready to go to college, mom said, French is nice, but you're going to have to get a job. You should think about the future, and Asia's the future. So this is back 1987, dating myself. But as I said, props to mom. I went into college at Washington University in St. Louis and decided to try Chinese, and ended up loving it to the point where I was a Chinese major, continued doing my French as well, but also did a business minor. And my whole goal was to see if there was a way to work for a big American company to help crack the China market. And as you all know, looking back at China in 1991, it was a very different landscape than where we are now. So what ended up happening was, after I graduated, I did a year of graduate study in Nanjing, ended up getting a job in a hotel in a management training program in Shanghai. And there was a big sporting event that was happening in Shanghai called the East Asian Games. And I ended up working in sales, banquet sales, and I managed the hospitality center that Nike had there for all the athletes and all the employees. So made a bunch of connections and just contacted Nike. And these were the early days where it was probably about 50 people working in the Guangzhou office, and became good friends with the team there, and just ended up getting hired into Nike China on the marketing side in 93. Basically, like I said, the very early days. Nike China was 2 years old that year.
Okay, so I'm going to get into that, but your Chinese is pretty good, yeah?
It's pretty good, yeah.
Yeah. Now, being Canadian, obviously, being a bilingual country, we learned French growing up. I felt that French background was really helpful, especially when it came to the vowel sounds of Mandarin. And I know this has nothing to do with business in APAC, and I know that's what our listeners are here for. But I want to ask you, have you ever thought that having that French background helped you with your Mandarin?
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of it is just, your brain as you're training it to learn a different language. And I didn't grow up speaking Tagalog, unfortunately. That was something my mom tried and I resisted on when I was young. But I think by the time I got into starting Mandarin, I'd already done 6 years of French. and just really enjoyed it. And I think, to your point, a lot of the sounds, the way that you vocalize is so different from English, but there is some similarities there. So I do think that if you are, enjoy a language and want to try a different one, I've always wanted to do Japanese, so maybe it's not too late.
I've heard that there's some similarities there, that if you have Japanese, it's a bit of an easier jump into Mandarin and vice versa. But you know what? If you ever do go down that road, come back and let us know if it was actually if your Mandarin background helped you. Okay, on to talking a little bit more about Nike. Okay, so you ended up being with Nike in Asia for 15 years, and then you were with Converse, which is owned by Nike, but you were on that side of the business for another 7 years. Okay, before we talk about Asia, the geography at a high level, I'd like just to ask you, what is it that Nike does obviously so exceptionally well, right? How have they managed to build this iconic brand that resonates with billions of consumers around the world from your perspective of your work in Asia?
Yeah, well, the thing that I'll always say about Nike, that I'll always have the utmost respect for the brand, is the focus on innovation in all regards. So obviously product, but when you look at the marketing and retail and digital, they really are world class. And I'd say not only in this, sportswear space. I think you look at a lot of those iconic brands that resonate with consumers. Innovation to me is the key that I always felt Nike was amazing at. And then really where they've dimensionalized the business is they're still so well grounded in and inspired by athletes, which is their core, but they've also stayed focused on their consumers, which are constantly evolving. You've always got new consumers, young consumers coming in. Just the 50-year anniversary last year for the brand, I think it just speaks to their focus and dedication on that core consumer. And then, I'd be remiss if I didn't say the talent level that they have and how they've invested in their people around the world over the years. I was so fortunate to be able to work in different geographies. They really create great paths for investing in their people to get opportunities to learn about different cultures. And frankly, just some of the best teachers you could possibly have in the industry.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I don't know if it's a chicken and egg or a hand in hand, but when you have an iconic brand, I think you have a bit of an unfair advantage to attract talent, because working for those types of brands is something that everybody strives to achieve. They want to be with those kind of brands. As much as people wear, Nike Air Jordans or something because they want to be associated with the swoosh, I think it also works in the asset of the people class of a company as well. So, well, kudos to you. I know it's really, really hard to get in. It's a tough position to win. You got in early. You hacked your way in, and kudos to you on going after what you want. Tell us a little bit more about the work that you did for Nike in Asia, and maybe some of your results that you achieved that you're most proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, it was like early days when you look at it from where we are today. And so part of the fun part of being with the brand back then was it was a much smaller organization. There was a lot more opportunity to delve into different areas of the business. And being in Asia, which was a pretty young region at the time, most of my time in Nike was in the footwear product management space, which was really, the role was we were representing the markets in Asia and then working with Beaverton to make sure that we could influence the product teams to have product that worked, as well as possible for the region, both performance and lifestyle. And as far as, like the part that I enjoyed the most before we got to the basketball role, which I know we're going to talk about a little later, was being in footwear, being in Asia in the late 90s, early 2000s. Those were the earliest days of Nike sportswear really coming to birth. And we were allowed and took advantage of making a lot of great collaborations with Japanese streetwear artists, creatives. We did all the initial Chinese New Year product for China as we were first coming out. So Like if you were to, one day I'm going to write a book about all the projects that we worked on, and I've got a nice little storage of ones that we made over the years. But that was some of the most fun part, was working in those early days, and even the early days of the internet, well before you had StockX and Goat and all of these other resale channels. It was just the whole hunt of finding those sneakers and making them was a ton of fun.
Okay, so you have the shoes.
I have some shoes, yes.
I don't even know if you're allowed to. Let me ask, how many pairs of shoes do you have?
In the triple digits.
Well, and you should. I think if you had said, "Oh, you know what? I didn't actually collect any shoes along the way," people would be chucking things around their house or their car wherever they're listening to this. They're like, why would you do that? But yes, no, I'm so happy to hear that you did. I'm also incredibly jealous. And diving into that, because your final role with Nike was as the GM of the Jordan brand. The jealousy is ripe right now in the Asia Pacific region. So can you tell us a little bit about that work? Was that an easy sell? Because, hey, Michael Jordan, it's the most, I don't know, one of the top 5 most iconic athletes, no matter where you are in the world. So, and following on that, what challenges? Was it difficult? Did what we think may have been really easy for you to do because of all the said leverage you have, were there a lot of challenges that a lot of people may not see or know that come with that advantage as well? So start with the good, and then let's talk about where some of the challenges may have been.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So actually, one thing at the time I was managing the GM, the Jordan brand, I was also managing Nike basketball. So it was a bit of a hybrid role at that time. The Jordan brand was still a relatively small part of the business globally, unlike today. So it was a hybrid role where I got actually the best of both worlds. I had Nike basketball and brand Jordan. And so for me, to be honest, I mean, it was a lot of work, a lot of pressure, but a lot of fun, because it was the 2 years leading up to the Beijing Olympics in 2008. And so, as you can imagine, from headquarters, there was so much focus in all aspects: product, marketing, retail development, everything. So we had a lot of resources. But what I really enjoyed about that was the early days of Nike shifting to the category formation that they called it. So I was the first GM of the category in Asia, and I had counterparts in the US and Europe as well. So there was a lot of jockeying for resources, but what was so fun was everybody on our team was singularly focused on basketball, and we were all super passionate about it. And so you had that laser focus that is, hard when you're a more generalist across a lot of different categories or different brands. So I don't want to say it was easy by any means, but we had a lot of wind behind our back, given that the Olympics was such a focus. And having both the U.S. national team and the China national team under sponsorship, where we had the apparel, we had the equipment, and then obviously with signature athletes, we did some special projects with LeBron and Kobe and Carmelo Anthony, specifically for China, specifically for the Olympics. So we had a lot of weapons to use to really amplify us. And what was great was I had counterparts where we were doing the same in soccer, the same in running, the same in sportswear. So it was an amazing effort that continues to this day. I mean, obviously with the Olympics, with World Cup, those are the key moments that Nike thrives on. So I was just lucky enough to be at a point in time. And then with the Jordan brand itself, Michael himself wasn't playing anymore at that point, but obviously the brand continues to resonate super strong. And,
Totally.
I grew up in Chicago. So for me, that was a bit of a job of a lifetime.
No doubt. I mean, I don't know if anybody wouldn't know this, but yes, Michael Jordan was famous from his time with the Chicago Bulls. Yeah, I mean, were there challenges involved in?
I think yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's pretty much the crux of it. I mean, you would just think this thing sells itself. I don't got to do anything. What kind of challenges are actually involved with that?
I think the challenge of anything in a big organization like Nike, and at the time, again, this is, nearly 15 years ago. So it's imagine how much more complicated it is in organization size. So I think the real effort comes from, being air traffic controller, aligning all the pipes, getting everybody together on the same page. And of course, working with the external partners. So I would say it's a little bit like, if you're the athlete itself. I mean, the number of people that are vying for your attention and trying to prioritize things within your scope. It was more of a, we were blessed with so many resources, but at the same time, there's a lot of attention, a lot of pressure. So it's a challenge in that way, but it's more managing the opportunity as opposed to, really scratching out and trying to create something from nothing.
Right. Okay. So you were responsible for Greater China, and at various times responsible for a lot of other markets. I believe doing some preliminary research, we counted up to 14 different geographies that you may have been responsible for in conjunction at the same time or separately within the Asia Pacific region, right? So with China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, all of that. Can you tell us a little bit about the nuances of the different markets and how Nike appeals to consumers in some specific regions that you can call out?
Yep. So for sure, my favorite part of working on the APAC region, and as I said, it's, nearly 30 years of being focused on the region, is the sheer diversity that exists across the region. So not that you don't have diversity in Europe or in South America or in other geos, but I think specifically with Asia, if you go from China to Japan to the Philippines to India to Australia, that's one of the parts that I've always loved, is that there's so many local nuances for the consumers in each local market. And even within countries, you have, sub consumer bases. So I think the key is, if you're a brand that wants to be global, it's important to know who you are at your core. And just to reference Nike again, with sport and innovation, those are the areas that are universal. But then the fun part is working with each of the markets and getting into communities and getting with consumers and really finding a way to be locally relevant. And a bit later, I'll talk a bit about what I believe that means from a product standpoint, from a marketing standpoint. But I think the most important thing to emphasize is it's one region geographically, but each country, and within each country, there's so many subsets that it's all about having curiosity and wanting to connect to those communities and to those consumers that gives brands the real opportunity to be successful.
Is it fair to say that going from Japan to Korea is less difficult than going from Japan to Australia on how deep into going back to the drawing board you'd have to go?
Yeah, I think it really depends. There's so many different angles to business success in our industry. So I think one simple one you could say is, if you talk about apparel and fit, the body shapes that people have in Australia versus Japan definitely creates some opportunities for local relevance. But if you're talking about trend, it could be something like color. It could be something like shapes of product or performance needs, or there's so many different angles to it. I think when you look at North Asia, if you look at Japan, China, Korea, there's a real synergy between the markets as far as influence goes, whether it's music or art, that does influence, this space for product. But I think it's fair to say, yes, you could break it down where Australia, New Zealand is very different, just happens to be in the same geography. But then when you get North Asia versus Southeast Asia, you also have climate, issues, year round hot in Singapore versus heavy winters in Japan. So there's a lot of things that you need to focus on even before you get to trend and fashion tastes.
Okay. So in that same vein, can you talk to us a little bit about how you and the work that you would do to localize marketing, merchandising, and maybe even, as you were mentioning, and kind of covered there, the product design?
Yep. So I think as time's gone on and it's such an interesting thing predating the internet to where, you had the opportunity to have different brand looks in different markets and not have much spillover across the rest of the world to where we are today, where everything is visible immediately to everybody in the whole world. And so I think that, the importance of local relevance in our industry is more and more important as far as having something special for consumers in a local way. And yet it's also very complicated for a global brand, especially when you think about the back end, about design and development and manufacturing and all of those challenges. You can't be everything to everyone. So I think that as you see in this space, more and more competitors, both international, I say international, meaning non-Asia based competitors, whether it's European or American brands, and then local, meaning regional, partners, creatives like, local brands, especially in China, that importance of being locally relevant is more and more important. So when I look back at my time, especially the Nike days, it was earlier days. So as we were getting more and more into Chinese New Year product or seasonally relevant product for Southeast Asia, again, year-round warm, instead of selling boots in Australia in the middle of summer, how can you make sure you have product that is actually relevant for the local environment? That was something that we were able to do. But I think as the years go on, it gets harder and harder because there are more and more competitors in our space and consumers are connected around the world and see, again, everything all at once.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever have the opportunity or spend any time deep at all in the merchandising space? Because I think that's an interesting point that I might lean on if you're up for it.
Yeah, no, totally. I'd say, with all of my brands, a heavy part of it was in the merchandising space, and where I feel we were really fortunate, especially in the later brands. So with Converse and with Vans, was we also had regional creation teams that we would partner with the global product teams and pre-plan what we would take from the global line and then what we would make locally for the local market needs. But really from day one with Nike as well, that was what our job was to influence the global team to try and get the product to be as relevant as possible. But whatever ended up from the global assortment, we would then build the sub assortment from within that was right for China, for Japan, for Korea. So merchandising has always been the core of what my teams did.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I'm kind of asking from a position of naivety because I don't know if consumers offline shopping in Japan have the same behaviors as offline retail shopping in Vietnam or in Singapore, right? Which would then lend itself to shop design and rack placement and where are display cases, right? And because I know that even comes to e-commerce merchandising, the layout of your website and how the pages flow and the navigational tools and things would be different. Did you spend some time in it? Was that something that was important to consider for the work you were doing in different areas?
Yeah, I think, the part that if you look at the industry where it was 20 years ago, as far as the majority of the business done in wholesale channels like a Foot Locker or a JD Sports or something like that, had the same in Asia. So in Japan, you have ABC Mart, you have partners across the region that would be really big partners for that more traditional multi-brand sneaker shopping. But I think what you've seen in the industry worldwide, and really we led this, it just happened in China where they leapfrogged into the stage where it's almost all mono-brand shopping. That wasn't the case in our industry, again, 20 years ago. But Asia really led the way, particularly China. So that was what was really great about working in the APAC region with China as one of the focus areas was you had the chance to do the old way of merchandising, again, for Japan or for Korea, where majority sales were still through multi-brand channels. So you had assortment strategies, but a lot was out of your control. But as soon as DTC, both brick and mortar and e-commerce became more and more important for the brands, then we as the product merchandising team would work with the retail planning team or with the e-commerce team. And then how we built assortments was built also considering, as you said, fixtures and how you would do layouts and what would your key story be at the lead-in table. And then on the digital side, obviously, there's so many amazing talents that are there observing how consumers are shopping, and then what's the product component of it. That was the part in my product roles that we would always work together with them on.
Okay. One last little point on the transition from, the Nike kind of Jordan business over to the Converse business. Slightly different attitudes. Right? I mean, Converse and Nike, back in the day were highly basketball driven. Both brands. Converse has, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like they're a bit of a skater type of cooler, trendier, for a little bit of a different demographic. So tell me a little bit about that, and maybe if there's some nuances to how the localization strategies might have differed between the two brands.
Yeah, and to be honest, that was one of the parts that was really appealing for me about moving from Nike to Converse was, love the Nike brand, will always love the brand and the performance and the innovation. And within that space, sportswear for getting into youth culture, into music and art and everything. But the Converse piece, if you look at the whole history and you look at the iconic nature, particularly of the Chuck Taylor, it's the OG of OGs, right? As far as the product goes, over 100-year-old. And I think for me, what was really exciting about the opportunity to move over to Converse was a really good friend of mine took over the region after Nike bought Converse. China was the first market that was converted from a distributor to an own market. And over the years I was there, we converted a few other markets, but it was really a very different challenge to entering the Asia marketplace, particularly because you mentioned it earlier, Nike would walk in the door and so many consumers knew who the brand was, wanted the brand, loved the athletes, everything. Converse was not in that space, nor really is any other brand, at that scale. So the challenge of coming into working with a smaller brand that had an amazing legacy, but wasn't necessarily in that same space, and frankly was much more focused on the lifestyle space. So depending on how old somebody is, you might remember running junior high track wearing Converse spikes, but that was a long time ago. Really, I would say since Nike bought Converse, there are areas they still focus on performance. So skateboarding is one. They are doing performance basketball product as well. But when I was there, the heavy focus was on dimensionalizing the Nike business with that lifestyle product. And again, the nice thing about the Chuck Taylor is it is such a universal, iconic style. And the partner that had worked with Converse before Nike came in had been doing it for 15 years. So there were thousands of stores across the market. They had built the brand up really well. They made product themselves. So we really just sort of did a takeover from what they did, partnering with them, and then carried it from there. But I think to your question about localization as well, that was the really fun part. If you think about the Chuck Taylor, and we always called it the blank canvas, there's so many things you can do with that from a design standpoint, materials, colors, zippers, adding tweaks on it, building platforms, a very different thing than the performance model that you would have at Nike as far as focusing on athletes and innovation. It was innovation of a different type, but in a much more creative way and very tied to music and art and all of those areas that I think have been in the DNA for a long time.
Yeah. Maybe I'm just putting this together for the first time, but I remember, and I've always called my Converse Chucks.
Yep.
Right? My Chucks. Is it come from the founder's name Chuck? I mean, is that where that all comes from?
So no, if you do a little Google search afterwards, Chuck Taylor was a basketball player, I believe in the 1910s. And so the signature model, which is the Chuck Taylor that the high cut has the star on the inside ankle, is Chuck Taylor. So it's his signature. So the model, it's the model name that's based on an athlete from very far back in the day.
Okay. Yeah. It's funny because everybody will refer to them as Chucks. And I've just called them Chucks because other people were calling them Chucks, and I've actually never known where that name come from. Thank you for that. Okay, let's move on to work that you did with Stussy. And so, being somewhat lesser known, and I don't think that's any shade on Stussy when we're talking about Nike, because everybody's lesser known. Tell us a little bit and explain to the audience exactly what the Stussy brand is, and share some your experiences that you had working there in the Asia Pacific region.
Yeah, so Stussy was an extremely exciting opportunity for me because it's a brand I grew up with. For people that know, if you do the research, you find out that Stussy really is the OG streetwear brand, founded in 1980 by Sean Stussy, a surfboard shaper. It's a very authentic brand that comes from originally surf culture, Southern California, but right away got into skate, into music. And, one of the amazing things thinking back to those early days was they very early on had connections into the UK and into Japan, into these organic communities tied again to skate, to surf, to music, to art, early adopted by a lot of people. And when you look at everything from Supreme to all the streetwear brands that have come after, everyone gives respect to Stussy as that OG brand.
Right. What was, if you can share, market size, and the exposure that Stussy had to the market in Asia Pacific, kind of as you arrived versus when you left?
Yeah, the cool thing about Stussy is, I think, again, people that know, but being that it's a privately held, family run company, they've kept the business purposely very small. I think it's, for anybody that's worked in a publicly traded company, it's counterintuitive. But when I came in, a lot of the strategy was to really just sharpen the focus, which was really had shifted from a legacy wholesale business, whether it was in North America or in Europe or in Asia. A lot of the business that was done was through multi-brand, but also coincidentally, this is mid 2010s. The focus on DTC brands was getting sharper and sharper, and just the team and headquarters had a vision that wanted to keep it and bring it back more to the DTC area. So I was lucky because in APAC, we had a 30-year partner in Japan, a 20-year partner in Australia, a 15-year partner in Korea that had really taken great care of the brand, done all the right things. And so my role was really to come in and help those markets where we had a longstanding partnership just tie more closely to global, whether it was product, whether it was marketing, and then really focused on our e-commerce and our stores. And the Stussy strategy is not to have hundreds and hundreds of stores. It's much more get those key locations that you want to have one store in, that's about community, that's about representing the brand. So we focused on those doors. And then my part that was extra exciting was finding new partners in other markets where Stussy hadn't been before. So whether it was Hong Kong or getting into some pinnacle distribution across Southeast Asia, getting up into China. So we now have a store in Shanghai and in Beijing. And so it was again, more connecting it to the global strategy, which happened to be about tightening distribution. So there was a lot of wholesale that Stussy used to be in that they moved away from in order to focus much more on being a DTC really led brand.
Okay. If you're a brand owner or brand decision maker, somewhere near the level of Stussy, given your 4 years there, and you alluded to some of the tactics and strategies that you were using, the work that you were doing, could you pass along any other nuggets of wisdom? It's a little bit different because, like you said, Stussy had long standing relationships. So some of the brands that might be listening may not have those. So you can try to blend that answer, knowing that maybe not everybody's going to have that if they're looking to enter that region. But, maybe just some advice and some wisdom on some of the tactics and strategies or experiences that you had in your role during that time that you could pass along.
Yeah, and I think your point is really a critical one, is that, similar to Nike, if you're a brand that has been around for 40 years and has established themselves as that authentic brand, it in some ways it's easier. In a lot of ways, it's easier than if you're starting off from scratch, if you're a young brand. I think that when you look at the history of brands that I think in the last 5 to 10 to 15 years that have done a good job of starting at a core place and then expanding in the right way. I think it really is, first off, knowing who your target consumer is and really making sure you stay true and focused on them, getting into the communities that you're trying to get into. And that's not just about transactions. It's about being connected to those consumers and the community members that you want to be a part of. And then I think it's also being realistic about how fast you can grow given the size of your organization and given the amount of investment it takes, not only financial, but also just manpower and hours to get into multiple markets. So I think a lot of it really has to come back. And a word I've used, a lot through this conversation is authenticity. If you start, what's the reason for your brand to be? And then who are you targeting and how do you connect with them? I think that everybody starts from one market. So if you're core market and you're connected and you're authentic there, that's the most critical part. But then as you decide you want to go broader, what's the reason you're going into those other markets? And why do those consumers, why would they want you, given that there's going to be a lot of other options for what you offer?
Yeah. We've seen a lot of brands. I mean, when I was in Asia, I saw a ton of new brands coming out. And I would say, as a consumer, I lacked some trust. I didn't feel or know their personality or their soul. And if I didn't know that and I didn't feel that, I felt that perhaps there was some opportunistic, mechanisms at play that were just trying to take my money. And so I do 100% agree with that approach and thesis of really being authentic. And you have to know why you're there, and you have to know why consumers should be interested in you or your product and what you stand for and what you're all about.
Exactly.
And I think if you don't know that, that's the first step, is figuring that out.
Totally true.
Okay, so I want to get to Vans because I'm taking a lot of your time already, and I'm aware of that. But the Vans is really interesting. One, you moved over to Vans just pre-COVID. Okay, so there's really interesting things in there because that was, I don't care if you have 300 years of experience. That's going to be something that you have to face with almost a new set of eyes, because very few things that have happened in the history of this life have kind of met us at this time with technology at that stage, not being able to move about and whatnot. So we definitely want to get into that, but I want to start with Vans has an unbelievable reputation for collaboration. They collaborate with other brands as well, if not better than that, and more often than most any other brands that you see. They're just so good at that. So I guess I want to ask first, why do brand collabs resonate so well with consumers in Asia?
Yep. So maybe I'll talk broader about Vans, and then I'll talk about the second question about collaboration specific for APAC. So for me, that exactly what you said, was one of the main reasons I was so excited to join Vans, having been a fan of the brand, all the years that I was working at other places. I think the purity and the focus that Vans has on their core consumer, on the skate and action sports industry. If you look at snowboarding, if you look at surfing, if you look at skate, the product, yes, but I think it's really more the ethos of the team and the people and the partners and that, over 50 years of authenticity in that space was another brand that I feel fortunate to have worked with, is that commitment to that core consumer. And I think one of the things, speaking to the collaborations, is a lot of brands do it because they want the hype, they want obviously the traffic, they want the sales, they want the awareness. And it's not that Vans doesn't have that mindset as well, but everything is born out of passion and authenticity. So when you look at a lot of the partners that Vans historically has done partnerships with, collaborations with, it's a mutual love and a mutual passion. And it doesn't have to just be about skateboarding. I think, the creativity aspect of what Vans is known for, whether it's music. You think about the Warped Tour for, North Americans that remember that 20-year arc that they did where they were sponsoring music festivals. And obviously you look at all the different areas. Again, I use action sports loosely, but I think it's just the authenticity that you have in all those sports that Vans was 100% and always has been 100% committed to. So I think in Asia, we don't have as long a history as obviously in America, but there's a lot of great stories that you could go back and look at what the brand was even doing 15, 20 years ago in China and Japan. Again, it's an over 30-year partner that we have there. Australia, another 20 plus year partner. So I think they have been able to be authentic in a way that very few brands have been over all the years. And that speaks just, again, a lot to the team and the passion for who that they're really, the communities that they want to be consistently a part of.
Yeah. I agree. It's funny. I'm thinking of my own closet and how many of these brands that I have, multiple purchases from all of them. It's pretty awesome. I wanted to ask if you could lay out, again, for the brand owners and trying to put myself inside of what they're listening to right now, what they might want to know. What are the benefits of brands doing collaborations with other brands? What efficiencies? What and what are the challenges? And what are the things that you have to be careful of?
I think the critical part, and again, with all of the brands I've been with, we've done collaborations over the years, and I think it gets more and more complicated as time goes on because more and more brands across more and more industries are doing it. So there's definitely an overabundance of collabs, as you mentioned. So what I found that I think is the most important thing is very similar to your brand's reason for being is what is the reason that you would want to do a partnership and with whom? And what I would say, the one obvious, there's two levels, I would say, of collaborations. If you do a collaboration with a very famous brand or a very famous influencer, you're going to get a lot of awareness. So if your brand is not as well known in Asia, one shortcut, one hack that you can do is to find a partner that you could work with. And ideally, it's an organic, authentic partnership that you do that this person or brand wants to work with you because they're passionate about your brand. So I think you can look back at examples where maybe it's a designer that skateboarded when they were 18 and now they're a very famous fashion house designer. But then when you tell the story, and it is all about storytelling, there's an authentic reason for that artist or that creative to work with this brand. But for some industries that are outside of our industry, it's a lot harder to maybe put those two together and it becomes more like a sponsorship. So I think that, if you're looking to find an authentic one, you have to look at it from your local consumer's perspective. So if you're a Western brand selling in Asia and you're working with a Korean influencer or a Japanese brand, you want to make sure that as you peel the onion back and you look at the reason for this thing to be, there's authentic reasons for it to be, and there's storytelling that you can tell as opposed to just putting one logo on another brand's product. And again, I think that finding those people that want to be part of your community that also have the ability and the influence to expose your brand to more people than you would just on your own. But it has to be authentic. That's really the advice that I would always say is if you do it purely for commercial reasons, a lot of people will suss that out. And I don't know that that's good long-term for brand building.
Yeah. Choose your partner wisely.
Yeah.
And I think what we're saying here around the collabs is that the whole, if done well, can be far greater than the sum of the parts.
Absolutely.
And so definitely look into it. We have to talk about the COVID thing. So I'm going to keep this pretty wide open. How did that go? What did you guys do? How did you pivot or iterate, or how did you just handle that entire scenario?
Yeah, you mentioned it earlier. The timing was really interesting. I joined Vans in November 2019, so just a couple months before things started up. And I think that, at the time, the Vans and the VF regional office was based in Hong Kong. And so I made the move up there. The family was going to come later. But then when COVID happened, came back down here and then worked remotely throughout the COVID period. And, the thing I would say that is really a testament to the culture and the leadership of the VF organization and the Vans organization within that was we had so much support all through that, not only for our internal teams, but also for our external partners. So at the time, I was managing all of our distributors across APAC, as well as some of the smaller markets that we directly managed. And of course, you have revenue expectations, you have Wall Street waiting for earnings reports and everything. And the unwavering commitment and support from headquarters, both regionally and globally, especially for taking care of the people, was amazing. So I think that's something that I was very fortunate to be in an organization that was so supportive through that. From a business standpoint, obviously there were challenges, and the unique thing again about doing an APAC role at that time was different countries were having different stages of store shutdowns, of all the different aspects, supply chain issues that everybody went through, right? So this isn't unique, obviously, to the company I was in, but as far as it went for us, what I thought was like, again, a testament to the strength of the brand, but also of our partners, was that as we were able to stagger shipments, or redo financing, or all the different things that good partners do with each other, I was really, including working with supply chain and the factories and manufacturing and everything. It was definitely hopefully a once in a lifetime experience. But I think a lot of it is being in a bigger organization that really cared about their associates, did make it a lot easier than I think if you were a small startup or if you had a restaurant, or all the different things that were affected. But it did give us a chance as well to really focus down on what are the core areas that we want to focus on. And again, what's our reason for being amongst all the other choices that consumers have, and a huge pivot to digital, which again is not unique to us, but that was an area where we learned a ton of things in the digital space that are continuing to be used and leveraged going forward.
Yeah, I think one thing that COVID did, I wouldn't say did well or anything of the ilk, but it really exposed companies that maybe didn't have the best financial management, and maybe and really didn't have the best relationship management. And if you had been focusing on that and really managing that well, COVID exposed you. And I think you were in big trouble because everybody needed to lean on everybody else.
That's it.
And they didn't necessarily have to, but if you had that relationship, you could ask of them, and they knew that it was important and it was mutually beneficial to work together to figure it out. And yeah, I think what you're saying is that you realized that was something that you guys had.
Absolutely. The partnership spirit and support of people, both emotionally, but also financially, every aspect of it. I mean, yeah, I agree with you 100% that was a testing time for everybody to see where your relationships all were.
Yeah. Okay. We have to get into the iconic Keldsen consulting. I mean, that's a natural move, I think, first of all, after everything that you've done. It was probably high time that you allow others to have access to the brilliance. So tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing now. Tell us about what the company is focusing on, what your work is focusing on, and then we'll get into stuff that you're seeing in the Asia Pacific region these days.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. I mean, it is something that, as you said, with all this experience and the network that I built over the years, it happened very organically, where a few years ago, a couple of different friends were starting up small brands. We're looking to kind of go expand internationally from wherever. I'm thankful to have so many connections worldwide that a lot of times it's just putting people together. So really what it's shifting to now, taking a bit of a break, life transition stage, and helping a few different friends, some in Asia, some in Europe, some in the US. In a lot of cases, like I said, just bringing people together. But in some cases, it's actually working with some small companies about trying to figure out what's the best entry into, it could be into Asia overall. It could be a specific market. It could be wanting to get into some channels that they haven't been in before. So it's pretty early days for it being a full-time focus for me. But it is something I'm excited about doing as far as really just leveraging those experiences and saying, okay, how can I help people get into this wild world we're in?
For those that have done it, for those that haven't done it, for those that are thinking about doing it, how has the leap into entrepreneurship gone for you? Has it caused you a little extra, time on the ticker?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think that, it's definitely, eat what you kill is a very different thing than working in a big company. And I think there's pros and cons. I really consider myself, my career arc, to be fortunate having worked for a very large company to two medium-sized companies to one very small company. I've had a bit of a taste of all the different ones. And I think for me, again, where I'm so fortunate is that when I look at the community of people that, my network that I built up and the people that I know, everybody's been so generous and kind in offering to help. And I'd say that's one bit of advice that I'm happy to share with everybody is, reach out to those people that you've built relationships with and just ask. I had a lot of people ask me over the years, and I'm finding that I'm getting a lot of that paid back to me, and I'm very thankful for that.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to prompt you for ways to get in touch for those who do want to connect with you in a little bit, and they have to wait for that. I want to ask you a kind of a broader question of everything that you've done and everything we've talked about. Where do you see consumers heading in the next handful of years?
Yeah, I think, and obviously talking on the APAC region, I think one of the big challenges that we're going to face, and it's not that hard to see, is the macro challenges that we're facing, obviously global inflation, but really a lot of the geopolitical stuff that unfortunately is happening. It is something that's a fact that I think is changing how I've seen the relationship between different markets. I think consumers at the end of the day, the large majority of them are not wanting to focus on that. They're wanting more to focus on their daily lives, their family, their community, their activities. So I think it's important, again, to go back to who you are as a brand and what it is that you want to be for those people. And then also acknowledging that an ever more competitive landscape is out there. Again, in our industry, if you look particularly at China with the local brands that are there in every industry, I mean, it's so much more competitive than it was before. So, but I think even with all that choice, if you have a reason for being that consumers want to connect with you, there's opportunity out there. It's really just picking those points that you want to go to, and also being realistic, as I said earlier, about your own capabilities and resources so you don't overstretch yourself.
Mm-hmm. What would you say are some of the top things that you would advocate brands to not do when they enter or exist in Asia that you're seeing maybe some other brands doing that you're like, I'm not so sure you should be doing that?
Yeah, this goes back again to my point on authenticity and knowing what your reason is for being is, I think a lot of times, it's always been that my whole time, it's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that is China, right? Or now you could say broader Asia Pacific, so many consumers, middle class, up and coming, all of those things. That's easy to say. But I think you also have to realize in each of these markets, there are local brands that are singularly focused on those consumers and understand what those consumers are looking for. Again, all of those things from fit to trend to materials to color to collaborations, whatever it is. So I think that a lot of the famous ones you would have seen of like the cultural clashes where they're not being sensitive to certain local cultural aspects. I mean, that's a very clear one to avoid. But I think it's more than anything, it's how do you come into a market and actually be authentic for yourself, but then have that local filter across it, whether it's where you're selling, who the partners are that are talking about your brand. And there's so many different amazing ways through digital social media to connect with consumers that I think it's how do you find those right ways to bring yourself to those markets, to those consumers, but in an authentic way, as opposed to maybe a ham-fisted sort of too obvious way.
Mm-hmm. Outside of talking to you directly, or perhaps listening to this podcast, what, in your opinion, are the best ways, the best channels, the most efficient mediums for brands operating in Asia to really get a good understanding of their customers?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, and I think this is one of the areas that, in my opinion, will always be the case, is having on the ground knowledge. So trusted partners, whether they're internal people, if you can afford to have internal people working for you in a region, or external partners that have the experience, have the network, have the local community connections. For everything you can do on the internet, I really still feel that nothing beats that on the ground connection that you have and the lived experiences, that people like us have had. If you can find those people and they are a fit for your culture, that's, in my opinion, the best way to, and it's also current. There are people living in the space right now.
Yeah, agreed. Quick tangent into something a little bit more future looking. I wanted to ask just about the metaverse. Where do you see the metaverse's position as a marketing tactic, as a channel for brands? How important do you think it's going to be, and how are you seeing any companies leveraging it right now?
Yeah, I think, going all the way back to making sure you know who your consumer is. In our space, I think there's no doubt in my mind that for our industry, it's something that more and more of our consumers are going to be interested in some capacity. A metaverse is such a broad word. Web3 is such a broad word. But I think there's no question that it's going to become more and more part of consumers' lives, especially as the younger consumers continue to grow. So I think it's important that brands have a point of view and have a strategy on it. Now, that said, I also think it's important, another version of what I've said earlier, is that you have to know what your capabilities are, your core competencies are, and you also want to come into this space in an authentic to your brand way, because I think a lot of times you see brands coming in, and if you're from that world, it feels very forced. It feels like not right for the community. And I think that's another example of coming back and knowing, why do you want to be in there? It's not just about selling more stuff. It's about being part of a community. But yes, in my mind, especially in our industry, it is something that I think more and more consumers are going to want a brand to be part of in multiple different ways.
What are a couple of examples of brands starting to leverage metaverse? I mean, is it product placement? Is it just logos, sponsoring, or how are they doing it?
To me, I mean, I think the easiest one to look at is what Nike has done with, they purchased a brand last year called Artifact that, where they're doing combinations of digital versions of product. And now they've just started making physical versions of it as well. They're working with athletes on coming up with ways to bring them into the metaverse. It's just, again, it feels like an easy answer, but I would say in our space, when I look at what Nike's doing, not just Nike themselves, but how they're investing in tech and investing in the whole blockchain world, I think they're the benchmark by far to look at. But they also have the resources that only Nike has. So I think for some smaller ones that, I don't have any examples off the top of my head that I would say these are small brands that are doing it well. But I think the part that I love about the digital space is the power it gives to creatives to not only bring their product to market, but also get paid for it. And I think that's an area where if you can connect into that space and be real in that space, working with creatives, that will help authenticate your brand by partnering with them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I would say go after it, because I think this is a more level playing field than you might be looking at right now, because there's a lot of the advantages that the big guys have, they don't have in the metaverse. You can, if you're hustling and highly tactical, you can be potentially more competitive there than you might be in more of the traditional landscape. So definitely agree with you there. I wanted to, and I alluded to this earlier, how can people get in touch with you or follow you or listen to you or consume your knowledge? Tell everybody, where are you?
I think the best way to the best way to get a hold of me is just to find me on my LinkedIn profile. It's got all my contact information there. Would love to hear from any of you out there, hear what you're up to.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. Similar for me. And the podcast. What, actually, we always ask a couple of names, maybe one or two people in the, in that region of the world, because, we have a lot of broad topical stuff. Maybe a couple of people that aren't replicas of you, but you think would be really, really interesting people, knowledgeable people to help us disseminating this information and education to brands wanting to enter the area.
Yeah, so I have a couple names for you. So a friend of mine named Mahmoud is he's over at Tommy Hilfiger, running the APAC region, and he was working at Timberland when I was at Vans. So I've known him from over there, but I think he's got a really amazing background and some interesting experiences to share. And then another friend of mine, her name is Jasmine. She started her own consulting firm called Epico Partners that is doing a lot of what I spoke to as far as helping brands coming in from international into the APAC region. She's based in Hong Kong. So happy to share their contact info with you, Todd.
Awesome. That's great. And you know what? Shout out to anybody listening, if you know of somebody who's quite thoughtful and experienced with Asia, we would love to be in touch and consider them to be on the podcast. Specifically, I would love to have more women. I know it's the nature of the game. We end up having more males than females, but I would love to have more women. So specifically, for those of you out there who know great women in the space, please feel free to push them towards us. So I'd really, really like to have more and more women on the podcast. It's kind of a focus of mine for 2023. So that said, thank you, Morgan. For those watching us on the video on YouTube, don't forget we have the podcast. If you need your hands and eyes and ears for other things, then you can go listen to the podcast. For those listening us to the audio version, come see us on our YouTube channel. With all that said, Morgan, thank you very, very much for being on the show today. It was an honor and a pleasure.
Amazing. Thank you, Todd.